I want you to go ahead and take a slow, deep breath in with me. Now let it out. You do this roughly 20,000 times a day, entirely without thinking about it. But what if that simple, involuntary action is doing a whole lot more than just keeping you alive? What if the very air filling your lungs right now is secretly, invisibly shaping your daily mental state? Today, we're unpacking a fascinating and honestly slightly unsettling body of scientific research. We're going to explore the hidden relationship between the air we breathe and our minds. Because as it turns out, our environment might literally be altering our emotional reality from the inside out. Now, to really grasp the sheer gravity of this, we have to take a look at the environment we all share. Right now, a staggering 99% of the world's population lives in environments that completely fail to meet World Health Organization air quality guidelines. So this isn't just an issue for people living next to heavy industrial plants, right? This is a massive universal reality. Almost every single one of us is continuously exposed to atmospheric mixtures of particulate matter and gases. For the longest time, we've mostly just thought about the impact of smog on our lungs or our hearts, but today we're looking much, much higher up in the body. Welcome to today's Explainer, the invisible threat, uncovering the link between air pollution and mental health. We are diving deep into a landmark systematic review from the journal Neurotoxicology. And let me tell you, the researchers here didn't just casually glance at one or two papers. They combed through over 200 distinct studies. Their goal was to analyze exactly how ambient air pollution impacts what we call internalizing psychopathology, specifically anxiety and depressive disorders. They wanted to know definitively, does bad air lead to bad mental health? And more importantly, could they track the physical footprint of that air directly into the delicate structures of the brain itself? This science outlines a truly wild biological pathway. The journey doesn't end in the respiratory system. It turns out these everyday pollutants, or the systemic reactions they cause in our bodies, actually journey upward into our front limbic brain regions. We're talking about the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Once inside, they trigger cellular chaos, inflammation, oxidative stress, and major neurotransmitter changes. And finally, this entire biological cascade culminates in the very behavioral symptoms we recognize as anxiety and depression. It's a direct line from the smog outside to the brain inside to how we actually feel. Chapter 1: The Invisible Mental Health Threat. Before we can really solve the biological puzzle, we have to understand what is actually at stake for our society. According to the data, more than 1 in 10 people globally live with a mental health disorder. Anxiety and depression are by far the most common. And we aren't just talking about a fleeting feeling of sadness here. We're talking about debilitating conditions that increase the risk of suicide, fracture families, and carry a completely devastating economic burden. These disorders cost the global economy approximately $1 trillion every single year in lost productivity. Grounding ourselves in those numbers is absolutely crucial because it tells us exactly why uncovering every single environmental risk factor, like the air we breathe, is an urgent public health mandate. Chapter 2: Linking Smog and Sadness. To establish this link, the researchers conducted a massive literature search divided into 2 distinct parts. When they focused purely on behavioral symptoms across 111 articles, the results were, frankly, striking. Out of those 111 articles reviewed, an overwhelming 73% reported that higher air pollution exposure was associated with higher internalizing symptoms and behaviors. Only 14% observed no significant effects, and about 13% had mixed or decreased findings. Guys, that is a massive consensus in the scientific literature. Whether observing humans in heavily polluted cities or controlled animal models in a lab, the vast majority of the data points in exactly one direction. More pollution correlates strongly with more anxiety and depression. The specific culprits the researchers tracked are fascinating, mostly because they're so utterly normal. The most commonly examined pollutants linked to these mental health outcomes were PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, and PM 10. Now, these aren't exotic, rare chemical spills. PM 2.5 and PM 10 are just fine and coarse particulate matter, things like dust, soot, and smoke. Nitrogen dioxide, that comes directly from burning fuel. We are literally talking about everyday vehicle exhaust from your morning commutes or the factory emissions from the city down the road. It's the standard baseline pollution that modern civilization pumps into the sky every single day. Now, you might be wondering, wait a second. People who live in highly polluted areas often live in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Couldn't the stress of poverty or a dangerous neighborhood be causing the depression rather than the actual air? Well, the researchers accounted for that. A perfect example is a 2021 study by Rubin and colleagues highlighted in the review. They tracked childhood and adolescent exposure to pollution and found it clearly linked to internalizing symptoms by age 18. But crucially, they completely controlled for family socioeconomic status, family psychiatric history, and severe neighborhood disadvantages like danger and dilapidation. Even when stripping all those other stressful real-world factors away, the air pollution itself remained a significant isolated culprit. Chapter 3: Inside the Polluted Brain. Okay, so we've established that human behavior changes, but how does the physical brain actually change when exposed to these everyday pollutants? For their second literature search, which looked purely at brain structure, the findings were undeniable. The review notes that air pollution was consistently associated with neurostructural and neurofunctional effects. In fact, a staggering 95% of the articles reported significant findings. 95%! It is exceptionally rare in neuroscience to see such a high level of consensus. The data confirms that pollution doesn't just make us feel different, it physically and functionally mutates the tissues and pathways of the brain. But where exactly in the brain is this happening? Well, the studies zeroed in on our emotional control centers. 66% of the studies focused specifically on the hippocampus, which is absolutely crucial for memory and the stress response. 7% looked at the prefrontal cortex, that's the brain's logic and regulation center. A small fraction looked at the amygdala, a primal fear center, and another quarter of the studies looked at multiple regions all at once. These frontal limbic regions are the exact same areas known to be deeply implicated in the pathophysiology of anxiety and depressive disorders. They're basically the emotional circuit board of the mind, and air pollution is, for lack of a better term, short-circuiting them. So the crucial takeaway here is that pollution doesn't just pass through our lungs and disappear. Once ultrafine particles cross the blood-brain barrier or trigger systemic immune responses that reach the brain, they unleash absolute biological chaos inside our emotional control centers. The studies consistently showed 4 major changes. First, severe inflammation. Second, oxidative stress, which you can think of as a sort of biological rusting of the cells. Third, major changes to our neurotransmitters, the actual chemical messengers of our mood. And fourth, neurite alterations, which literally means the physical branching structures of the brain cells are being damaged or fundamentally changed. Chapter 4: The Animal vs. Human Gap. At this point, the evidence seems pretty airtight, right? We know the air is dirty, we know it correlates with depression, and we can physically see the brain mutating. But to find the glaring blind spots in our current understanding, the authors compared the demographics of their 2 separate literature searches. On one side, we have literature search 1, dealing purely with outward behavioral symptoms. On the other side, we have literature search 2, dealing with the internal imaging and structural data of the brain. When you put them side by side, a very problematic discrepancy emerges. The contrast here is massive. In the behavioral studies, a very healthy 76% of the research was conducted on actual human beings. We have mountains of epidemiological data tracking millions of humans and their psychological feelings. But in the brain imaging studies, only 11% of the research involved humans. That means 86% of all the data we have showing how pollution physically degrades the brain relies entirely on animal models, like mice and rats. This heavy reliance on animal models reveals some major gaps that we urgently need to fill. First, we have a severe lack of human functional MRI studies. We know the structures change, but we aren't really watching the human brain process emotion in real time under polluted conditions. Second, and this is just wild, 66% of the animal brain studies focused exclusively on males. Why is that a problem? Because in humans, internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression actually affect females at significantly higher rates. Relying mostly on male animal models leaves a massive gap in solving this puzzle for the most vulnerable populations. Finally, out of over 200 studies, only 13 actually measured both the brain changes and the behavioral changes simultaneously in the exact same subjects. Chapter 5: Why this matters now. All of this heavy, complex neurobiological data isn't just for textbooks. It sets up the ultimate question that future science has to answer. We need studies that ask, does air pollution directly cause anxiety and depression because of those specific frontal limbic brain changes? Right now, we have 2 separate pieces of the puzzle. We see the depression in populations, and in separate studies, we see the physical brain damage. But we need targeted research that links them directly together in humans. Because if we can definitively prove that pathway, it entirely shifts how we treat these conditions. It means we might need environmental interventions just as much as we need psychological ones to stem the tide of these disorders. So I'm going to leave you with this to ponder. How does knowing the invisible biological impact of the air we breathe change the way you view the future of our public health? The next time you walk outside in a busy city, you aren't just navigating traffic. Your brain is navigating a complex chemical environment that is actively interacting with your emotional well-being. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material for today's explainer. If you found this connection between our environment and our minds as fascinating as I did, keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and we will see you on the next one.